Hey guys, this is Mr. Arvidas again. So today we decided to record a PowerPoint on the Atlantic slave trade. The reason for that is this is a pretty important topic in AP World History. It's one that appears on the AP exam countless times over and over and over again. Throughout this presentation, it's not going to last more than about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about where you're going to see it, how you're going to see it, and what you really need to know out of it. Because the trick with AP World is obviously there's so much content, and you don't need to know it all, but you do need to know major themes, and that's what we'll be looking at throughout this presentation. So I think it should be a pretty easy thing to follow, but here we go. You know, Atlantic slavery, why is it important for AP? Well, you have to, honestly, just looking at this map, it kind of gives it away. This is one of the largest cultural exchanges in the history of mankind. What we see are three parts of the world. This is a triangular trade diagram that are connecting. Now, that connecting is not always positive, it's not always good, but it happened, and so that's what we need to know. It should also be noted that because of this, Europe saw a distinctive rise in their power, both economically and politically. It is a direct result of the slave trade and the economy that the Americas presented, specifically countries like Britain, countries like Spain, countries like the Netherlands rose in prosperity as a result of this. I think it should also be noted that this is a trade system. So in a trade system, you do have other sides making money. And so it should be noted that Africa does make money off this. So there's a couple of things we're going to really talk about. We're going to talk about the social impact of this, because obviously socially this changes the whole dynamic, specifically of the Americas and the Caribbean area and South America. Obviously changes a lot. Plus you're going to get that southern east coast of the present day United States. The other thing we're going to be looking at is the causes, effects, why this practice took place, what makes it different from the other economic practices we've looked at. Because obviously we've seen feudalism, we've seen a caste system, we've seen slavery in multiple different fashions, but what makes the Atlantic slave trade different? And that term chattel slavery comes in, definitely referring to them as beasts of burden, which is a pretty horrific thing, and that's what we'll be talking about. So I think to start, let's look at Europe in this time period. Now I have a couple of dates on. Well, I have one date on here. I should have another one, and that should be about 1450. The reality is that the expansion into the Americas occurs for a bunch of different reasons. One of them is the rise of the Ottoman Empire, fall of the Byzantine Empire. That's a big cause in expansion to the New World. Now that's not what we're focusing on today, but figure that could always help you out. But I think it's important to note 1492, big year, obviously, Christopher Columbus. Now, if you have read up on Christopher Columbus and his lovely exploits with the natives, through his fault and through a lot of biological reasons, that had catastrophic impacts on the native populations. And so because of that Spanish intervention in the Caribbean and in South America in 1492, what we saw was a massive decrease in population in the native peoples of those areas. Now that decrease in population is extremely important, because what it does is it is going to create a need for a labor force, and that labor force can come in multiple avenues. It can come with prisoners, it could come with indentured servants, it could come with people migrating, or with slaves. And slaves will be the option that is the primary focal point of the economic growth in this time period. Now, as a result of this, we have to understand Spain's wealth from essentially 1492 to 1600 grows exponentially. Now, why? They're the only player in the game, or at least major player in the game. They get large amounts of silver from the Americas. Now that also devalues silver, but that's besides the point. But the natural resources they get are also going to be staggering. Now, I think it's important to note Great Britain at the start of this is a train wreck. The 1500s for Great Britain is a tumultuous time period. You have the Protestant Reformation, of course, the Church of England is formed. Then, of course, You're going to get Henry VIII, then you get Mary, then Elizabeth, and they go to war with Spain, and Britain really isn't in the colonial game yet, but they will be in the early 1600s when they start Jamestown, Virginia. You know, Jamestown, important to kind of note, Jamestown is a pretty bad colony until a man named Rolfe gets some tobacco seeds, plants them, and within a couple of years you have slavery taking place in Jamestown. Why? Because there's tobacco, large-scale farming is taking place. And so slaves are going to be used to facilitate that. It's what makes Jamestown valuable. It's what makes the British colonies expand. It's the reason we see more colonies develop in that southern area. The mythos sometimes is that Britain was settling for religious freedoms. Well, the people of Jamestown, it's not necessarily the case. It's economic freedom. It's the ability to make money. And Jamestown certainly did that with tobacco. France is another one that's in an interesting spot. Throughout the 1500s, the Protestant Reformation does a toll on France. People forget that France goes through a civil war period. You have the War of the Three Henries, which is a lovely European history escapade that you can go under if you take that course. France's New World holdings are far less significant. A couple of islands in the Caribbean, but more or less they restrict themselves, Louisiana, Canada, and their slave trade is distinctively later than the other two. But they're going to actually have slaves that get imported into France as well, not on the same quantity, but they're going to be involved. Portugal, I think, is the one that's really important. It's also the country that gets forgotten. These last two, really, Portugal and the Netherlands. Portugal is important because they make first contact with the Africans, and they go right along the coast of Africa. And because they go along the coast, they make port contacts. They set up trading hubs, the forts, if you will. And what they end up doing is first they want gold and silver and diamonds and things of that nature, but eventually they get involved in that slave trade, and they become kind of the carriers of this. It should also be noted that Brazil is the single largest place that slaves went, and that's something we can talk about in a little bit. The Netherlands represent an interesting aspect. They get involved in this a little later as well because, one, they weren't a country in 1500, or they were, but not quite. They won't really get into prominence until that 1600s area, and they get really big in the carrying trade for spices, obviously, in Asia, but then in the slave trade, they begin to do a lot of carrying back and forth of slaves to the various colonies and setups that the Europeans had. So understanding all of these countries kind of helps you get that. What we should also note is the end result of this. Great Britain becomes the most powerful country in the world by the 16 or 1760s. Spain, which is looked at as one of the most powerful countries in the world, diminishes in power by the end of this. The Netherlands becomes extremely strong economically. France, of course, who gets on the tail end of this, is going to be extremely powerful, mostly for their own resources at home. But let's move on. So the thing that I think a lot of guys and girls take this course get confused about is Africa. And for some reason, I don't know, maybe schools don't do it justice, but a lot of students go in thinking that Africa is a place that did not have large civilizations, did not have cities, did not have much culture, and that couldn't be any further from the truth. The reality is there are large countries in Africa, and there are plenty of places that we would consider developed. African society is one that's very complex. Obviously, you've learned about the Bantu migration, which created a unified language, cultural system that still exists at that point in time. We have a lot of groups that are ethnic groups. So the idea that Africans sold Africans into slavery, while it's true, it would also be like summing up, well, Europeans killed Europeans in wars. Of course they did. They're from the same continent, but that doesn't mean they're from the same people. And I think in African society there was a distinct line that was drawn there. And it should be kind of noted that to assume that all Africans are the same is a pretty ignorant statement. We get a number of large countries in Africa that form, and a lot of these countries formed years before the slave trade ever existed. And the idea that these were just ignorant pagans who were, roaming around in the wilderness is ludicrous. Complex civilizations, you've obviously learned about Mali by this point in time. Ancient Egypt is, the early African civilization, but there are far more than that. And we could go into that in large detail and talk about the Congo. We could talk about Benin and places like that, but it doesn't really suit us. What we do have to understand is that there was a lot of absolutism in Africa, and they really did like that idea of the absolute ruler, the ruler appointed by God or Allah or pagan gods, and so that definitely did click. Absolutism also presents conflict. And because of that conflict, the slave trade arose. Now, slavery had existed in Africa prior to this, long time prior to this, but it was a little different. Slavery in Africa usually didn't last generationally like slavery will in the Americas. There was an assimilation process that took place, but the nature of it was there, just the scale of it was not. So there was already slave-centered commerce. Now, where did some of that commerce go? Well, it went to the Middle East. Originally, you had a lot of Middle Easterners buying African slaves for various reasons, but it still wasn't as large scale as it was. It's not until Europeans have the need that this trade is created. And I think it's important to recognize that. The Europeans are going to exploit the nature of Africa's political climate. The fact that you have a lot of absolute states that go to war with each other creates this ball of energy and hatred that's going to fuel war. And the Europeans are going to exploit that to the fullest. Because what are they going to sell Africans? Well, they're going to sell them a number of products, including guns and weapons. And a lot of times the Europeans double dipped. When they had two countries going to war, they wouldn't just sell one country weapons, they would sell both. And that allowed for, in their minds, an even exchange of conflict, but realistically it allowed for them to get slaves from both sides and continue a conflict, perpetually overall. Two of the main places that usually we talk about, the Asante and the Dahomey in Africa. Most of the African slave trade, as you'll see in a graph that's going to come up in a second, comes from that Central Africa, right where the curve is. The Slave Coast is what it was nicknamed for a long period of time. Benin is another big one that's a big part of this. But the slave trade becomes something that's a hot commodity. So I want you to understand this. For the African countries who were in that trade, who were trading slaves, it's not that they were trading their own people in their minds. They were invading another people, taking them over, shipping them off, and trading them. Now, at times, that's not the absolute case either. Sometimes they did just imprison their own people and ship them off across the Atlantic. But then again, there are no absolutes in history, and I think that's a very important thing to understand. Now, the idea that Europeans took over Africa in the 1600s is completely false. They exploited the political climate and the disunity amongst most of the African kingdoms and tribes to facilitate this slave trade, but they did not take it over. None of them had the resources to take over Africa or most of these countries at that moment. We'll save that for the 1800s and the age of imperialism. But for all intents and purposes, that should be noted. That doesn't mean Europeans are not guilty of the trade. They are the reason it's happening. But you can't just solely blame them. There are other factors involved. What does all this mean for us? Well, it means a bunch of different things. It means that if you're looking at the causes, right, if you're looking at our causes of the slave trade, we have a couple of different things we can look at. One, there's a need, right? There's a distinct need for slavery. Now, what is that need? The need is labor, right? There's a labor force that needs to happen. If that labor force is there, they're producing crops. These crops, generally cash crops, it's going to be something that we talk about in a minute. Tobacco, in particular, becomes a big one. Sugar becoming another one. The need for labor force for these crops. There was also mining that took place as well. And there's a need for this because Europeans don't have the population. Now, what happens from, as we know, from about 1550 to 1750 is a massive increase in population in Europe, and that comes from a lot of the food products that are brought over from the Americas to Europe, specifically the potato and maize. So very good so far. Now, the things that we haven't really talked too much about yet are the specifics and how this is going to end up shifting. The Middle Passage is something that you see in AP, or I would imagine you'd see in AP in a form of a short answer question. It just makes sense to have it in a short answer question. You could see this in AP US, you could see this in AP Euro and AP World, so this is a pretty easy explanation. The Middle Passage is exactly what it sounds like. It is the middle part between Africans being captured in Africa and then being sold in the Americas. And the slave ships are the most prominent form of this. So the Middle Passage is a pretty grueling process. Anywhere from 12 to 15 million people were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean in slavery. It's crazy because when we look at the boats and how they designed them, and you can see from these diagrams and these pictures that I put up here, they tried to maximize the space, and this is pretty horrific. We're talking about 4 square feet, 5 square feet per person. They're chained down to these slabs, and it's a pretty grueling process. Remember, this journey takes 5 to 6 weeks across the Atlantic. The mortality rate in these ships is pretty high. They try to not exceed 25%, but a lot of times it does. Some people have said the mortality rate was as high as 50%. In the AP books I've seen, they tend to go with a lower number of 18 to 25%. Now, why is the mortality rate even that high? Well, the thing is the way European slavers thought about this is there were losses that they knew they would have. They knew they would lose a certain amount of people, and so they had systems in place. If people weren't compliant, they'd throw them overboard. If they were sick, they'd throw them overboard. Some slavers believed in killing someone from the get-go to set the tempo of the journey. And so this becomes a pretty horrific process. And the thing we should remember, these are not, when you use the term slaves, you negate the human aspect. These are people who are being taken away from their families, their culture, everything they know, put on a boat, locked away, and shipped across an ocean. Many of these poor souls probably hadn't even seen the ocean prior to this. That's the horror of slavery. And it is a situation that I don't think is easily comparable to anything that we've seen recently in history, but it is pretty bad. The Middle Passage is a awful scenario, and it should be treated as such. Now, what for AP would they ask you about? They might ask you, really, they might just ask you what it is, or aspects of the slave trade, and the Middle Passage could be an answer for that. Describing the Middle Passage as a horrific treatment of people. They're loaded on like animals. That's the key, right? That's the key point that I always like to try and make my students understand, is that they treated slaves like animals, like beasts of burden. And the idea that slaves, had it good or had freedoms and stuff that people like to do now is absolutely ludicrous. The Middle Passage demonstrates the just lack of human decency that took place during this practice, and that's what should be noted from it. And it is just another detail to include if you do happen to have something about slavery on the AP exam or in your AP tests. And this is the big thing that I think comes up. So for AP, they like to talk about economic impacts, and triangular trade, of course, is that economic impact. This is a diagram that's in like every textbook known to man. I forgot which one I pulled it from, but they always have something like this. And we see the stuff going to Europe, from Europe to Africa, and from Africa over here. And what's crazy is what we see actually being sold. All the different things that are being grown, obviously, and farmed and goes to Europe, and Europe benefits by far the most off triangular trade. Okay, but we should also note that the African kingdoms, specifically along the slave coast, they do benefit from this. They do become more powerful. They do get larger wealth. Now, it's artificial because they're at a constant state of war and they're spending lots of money to do that. But the rulers of those places feel that they are benefiting immensely from this. Now, slaves that go across the Atlantic obviously are going to be working in this economy. The Americas, North America does not grow in the way that it does without slavery. That is a fact. You know, the Indies would not be a prosperous place if it's not for the sugar growing that takes place there. So I think it's important to recognize this. This creates an economic system. Everything funnels to Europe is the important thing to understand with triangular trade. Everything's got a funnel. So this chart does a great job of doing what we just talked about. It shows you the amount of slaves that were imported into certain regions. And so I think we have to notice a couple of things. And AP loves to do this. So this is actually a kind of an AP type chart. So if you look at this, the minus North America should be something that you find immediately. Portuguese, mostly Brazil, something you should find immediately. Multiple choice questions they like to ask out of this would be, why? Why is this so high? And the answer is going to be very simple. We talked about this before. Death rates. The death rate of slaves in these areas was a lot higher. Why? They're growing sugar. The climate's bad. The treatment of them was terrible. And so they had to funnel in more and more and more slaves. The Spanish Empire, you have a large quantity, and I think that's very important to recognize, large amounts of people. The one that usually throws people off is British North America, and why it's so small in comparison. Well, it should be noted that it's small for a couple of reasons. One, they don't control it for the entire point of this time period, right? And so slavery is going to distinctively change in North America. Plus, the big influx of slaves is in the late 1700s and the 1800s when the cotton trade becomes extremely valuable in the Americas. When Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, it completely changes the whole aspect of this. And so that's something that kind of throws people off a little bit. Now, these two pictures are very much important for us in terms of AP. They love visual sources, right? Love those visuals. And so they show a couple of things, right? Right here, sugar plantation, harvest time, and what are they doing? They're putting them in boilers. And this shows you a much larger part of this, putting them in boilers. And the reality was sugar was a crop that could spoil very quickly. So right after it was picked, they had to boil it down and process it. This was extremely dangerous. And a lot of slaves died doing this. They would lose hands, they would get scolded, they would cut themselves on the cane and get infected and die. And that's why the replacement was so hard. It also made sugar a really hard crop to grow in the sense that it was labor intensive. And so the slaves who were working in these sugar plantations had to work sometimes, 36, 48 hours straight right after harvest to boil the sugar down, get it processed so they could store it and sell it. It should be noted too that sugar is not an essential crop. It's not something people need to survive. Sugar in a lot of ways is a vice, or it's something that is not needed but people want. Tobacco, same thing, something that's not vital to your survival but people want. Cotton, same thing. Why is this important? Well, that's a big shift in how people are living and what they're growing. It also shows us an economic difference that Europeans who are buying this sugar have income. So there's obviously a growth in a secondary class now that we're seeing develop in both the New World and the Old. And we're seeing an economy that becomes far more diverse, where people can afford to spend money on things that are non-essential. And I think that's important to recognize here. These pictures do a great job of displaying the hard work in there, and I like to put them up there because you should be exposed to as many visual sources as possible. And in this one alone, we can see a number of things taking place in here. People working in the back, people processing the sugar, the actual mill itself. And so it shows us a whole aspect of it. And here, of course, we see that. And if you notice, the overseers always have, it's one thing they always like to do. They're pointing out the weapon, right? There's always, the whip, the cane, the sword. So this is a great little map here. It showcases a number of different things for us. It's another good visual source for us to use. A couple of things we should make note of right away whenever we look at this. One, present day African boundaries. These are not the countries that existed at that point in time, though some of them, name-wise, should sound familiar. The others, the percentages, 65-35. Huge percentage here, huge percentage here. So the question becomes, why? Well, we just saw pictures of sugar crop, right? So sugar plantations had a high mortality rate, right? And so because of that, we saw high death rates in the slaves, which caused them to import more and more and more and more, right? Feeding the plantations because they were losing so many slaves. When you're talking about people with life expectancies of less than 25 years, that's not good, okay? That's something that's pretty horrific in general about this. The other thing I think this also shows you is how large these are becoming. This is a huge shift economically, large colonies, large settlements taking place here. The other thing this map shows us is where geographically slaves came from, which I think is also extremely important. And it should be noted that this also shows us something. The 5% to the United States or North America, because what it shows us is something that people don't always recognize. This is a diverse economy that's taking place here, where you have multiple things going on. While it is dependent on the slave trade, and the slave trade is going to be the catalyst that actually causes the United States to grow, it is not solely reliant on it like the West Indies will be and like Brazil will be. And so it gives it a little bit more flexibility, but it's still reliant on it nonetheless. Global economic impact of this stuff. Well, this was the one I talked to you about in the beginning. European dominance. Because of the slave trade, it allows Europe to grow wealth substantially. You think about Great Britain monopolizing tobacco. It allowed them to tax it and to sell it to everybody. It's also addictive, which helps. Sugar, by the way, also in that same regard, sold by all these countries, and they tax it and they sell it, and it creates large-scale economies. They also get a little bit more specialization because there's a decrease in the labor force needed for that. And so in their colonies, we see a large amount of growth in terms of cultural. I think this is going to cause Africa to have, or at least West Africa, to have a period of constant conflict. This is going to be something extremely important in the development of Africa. People ask, well, why didn't Africa do this? Why didn't they do that? Well, being at war for centuries and having a trade where you're exporting 18 million of your people is going to have some negative consequences. And in U.S. history, I always like to say one of the most tragic parts of the slave trade, and it's all pretty tragic, is how many of those people on boats would have been great doctors, would have been the Shakespeares of their culture, would have been, the artists, the rulers, the great thinkers, but they were never given a chance. Instead, they were put in chains, shackled on a boat, left to die. This is something important. Paid laborers replaced with slavery. Why, if you were a plantation owner, would you want to pay laborers? No, you're going to use slavery. Now, yes, they use indentured servitude as well, but slavery becomes the primary focal point of how they make money and how they grow. And this goes along with what I said earlier. In settlements in the Americas, we get more specialization because their people have more ability to work. You don't have to be a farmer. You can actually do something else. We think back to some of the early leaders in American history. Thomas Jefferson lives on a plantation, but he does a million other things, most of them not even involved in his plantation. Why is that? Because he had the ability to, because other people did the work of his family for him. So I think that's important to recognize. This happens in all the colonies too, and in the Spanish colonies it happens. It happens in Brazil for the Portuguese settlers who settle there. We do see more specialization. What does AP want out of this section? So they like to do that change over time essay, or continuity and change as they call it now. They usually refer to this in an economic sense or a social sense. So what you'll see is describe the continuity and change in the Atlantic world from 1450 to 1750. Well, it's slavery, guys. It's slavery. It's a buildup of European wealth. That's what it is. The other aspect they'll do is in the Caribbean world, describe the continuity and change of the economic systems. So there's a couple things you could do. One, I would talk about natives in that, because as we talked about all the way in the beginning of this, the natives died, right? They are replaced with African slaves, and that's a huge change. That's a massive change. Now, why did this happen? It was largely due to disease, and then the desire right? The desire for more crops, cash crops like sugar and tobacco and things to that nature. So that's another big thing. That's usually where you see it. You don't see too much comparative stuff, but you usually see the change over time in this one. Causation would be another one. You know, the causes of why slavery was so big would be another one that you could say. But other than those two, I think you really wouldn't see that. Now in causation, if you're talking about, you know, what's the causation of these? Well, it's pretty simple if you think about it, right? We have the Ottomans creating an expansion overseas, but you don't have to do that. You could really just do, European expansion combined with the natives dying into, the growth of nation states in Europe leads to slavery. Now you could also, and really you would probably include Africa in here in terms of the political situation that's going on in Africa, the fact that it already existed and everything else. But end all be all, what is all of this about? It's about money, principally. Does race become a huge part of it? Yes, race becomes an immensely large part of slavery, but it starts off because of money. But in the words of many historians, including many who write these history books, you can't subjugate people without thinking you're superior. So race has obviously always been kind of a underlying factor for Europeans, and I think that should be noted, that race is in there. But the main motivation is money, and that should be the main motivation you think about. Well, that's it. It lasted about 30 minutes, but I hope it helped, and hope you guys do well on this.